watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture. Funding for Shalom TV has been provided by the following. And by viewers like you.
The truth is that the news actually set us up very well today. I had a different opening in mind, but sometimes you got to react to what happens. The United Nations voted today, 114 to 18 with 30-something abstentions, to endorse the Goldstone Report. And the Goldstone Report needs to be seen for what it really is. And the vote today needs to be seen for what it really is. It is effectively a referendum on the legitimacy of the State of Israel. Because every nation state and every democracy has an obligation, first and foremost, to defend its citizens. If you were being shelled for 8 years from Canada, that would be quite a trick, but let's just imagine it for a moment, you would expect your government to actually do something about it. And if this community had been shelled for 8 years, 8 long years, and no one had said a thing anywhere in the world. And what happened there happened here, which is that 11 and 12 and 13-year-old children started to wet their beds again, night after night, month after month, year after year. And families with teenagers all slept in the same room, night after night, month after month, year after year, because if a shell hits in the middle of the night, the last thing you want is to be in separate rooms. And if the economy here had collapsed because anybody with any sort of economic mobility left the minute that they could, so half the houses were for sale and half the storefronts were shuttered up. And that had also gone on for years, day after day, month after month, year after year. If you would watch this community simply be destroyed by missiles or rockets coming in from someplace else, and for 8 years, your government had done very little to support you, and the international community had said nothing in your defense. If one day the United States actually woke up and went to battle to make sure that you could restore some semblance of normalcy to you, and the world immediately responded on the first day of the conflict and said that America had completely overstepped its bounds, you would wonder where the sanity in the international community had gone. But what I described for you is exactly what happened. Exactly what happened. The hostilities actually began, or Israel's long overdue, years overdue, an attempt to put a stop to this. By the way, it was a successful attempt. It's been relatively quiet since the end of the Gaza operation. It started on a Shabbat. It actually began on a Saturday morning, Saturday early afternoon. By the time Shabbat was over, by the time we made Havdalah, the international community was already calling for the withdrawal of Israeli forces. So too, by the way, were some American Jewish organizations, which name we will not name. After 8 years where nobody had said anything, it took less than 12 years for the world to decide that the response was completely disproportionate. And the vote today is fundamentally must be seen. And the following is not meant to be hyperbolic or unnecessarily provocative. But the vote today must be seen as the other side of the same coin on November 29, 1947. The vote today is effectively the United Nations way of saying, we regret the vote of 1947. And if we could vote again today, this is true, if we could vote again today, we would not vote to create the Jewish state. That's the world in which we live. The world in which we live is a world in which the international community believes that it made an error in 1947 and in 1948, and that explains why there are no sanctions on Iran of any substance whatsoever. And that explains why a completely lopsided report gets overwhelmingly endorsed by the United Nations. Because the world's filled with regret. So too, by the way, are an increasing number of young American Jews filled with regret. And in the book, Saving Israel, How the Jewish People Can Win a War That May Never End, and I'll come back to why the subtitle is what the subtitle is in a short while, I cite a study done by two American Jewish sociologists, Stephen Cohen and Ari Kelman, called Beyond Distancing. It's available on the internet. You can find it very easily. And among a whole series of questions that they ask American Jews of all different sorts and of all different ages, if the Jewish state were to be destroyed, not wither away or gradually disappear, but if the Jewish state were to actually be destroyed, would it constitute for you a personal tragedy? And not surprisingly, when you looked at Jews 65 years old and over, 80% said, yeah, well, obviously, of course, I mean, the destruction of the Jewish state's unfathomable and unthinkable, but if it happened, yeah, it would be an unbelievable personal tragedy. But at the other end, and also not surprisingly, by the time you got to Jews about 30 years old, more or less, and younger, a full 50% responded and said that no, the destruction of the Jewish state would not constitute for them a personal tragedy. And for reasons that we won't go into right here, the study did not include unmarried people or intermarried people. So it actually took a somewhat more traditional slice of the American Jewish community than an entirely random sampling would have been. And so therefore, if it had taken a really random sampling of the American Jewish community, more than 50% would have said that the destruction of the Jewish state would not constitute for them a personal tragedy. That's where we find ourselves. We find ourselves with an international community that has effectively said if it had a vote again today as to whether to create the state, it would not. And we find ourselves with an American Jewish community, in its younger generation at least, that is tired, that is ashamed, that is confused. It feels that Israel is somehow a violation of its core Jewish values because increasingly its core Jewish values are simply universal Jewish values. And it's hard for them to say to themselves anything about why the state ought to be necessary. The third and final point that I want to make by way of introduction is to say that if you do a Rorschach test, but not a real Rorschach test, but a fake Rorschach test, and you say something like Israel to young American Jews, and you ask them simply to imagine, to say what they think. You say Israel, what comes to mind? What comes to mind is occupation, checkpoints, warfare, conflict, Palestinians, rejection, shame, etc., etc., etc. It is not what would have come to mind when I was a kid and when many of you were younger. In 1967, when I was a relatively young kid, and those 6 days in June unfolded, what would have come to mind is spunky, brave, saved, the little engine that could. And what was once the great hero of the international community is now the great villain of the international community. And the fundamental argument of the book, which we're speaking about this evening, Saving Israel, is that because unfortunately the conflict is not going to be ended at any time in the near future. President Obama is figuring it out slowly but surely that this is a very, very complicated problem. Abbas is once again resigning because what else do you do when the going gets tough? Because the conflict is not going to end anytime soon, and I want to make it very clear that I say that not cavalierly, and I say that with no joy or levity. One child who was already in the army and is out, another one who is in a combat unit and is in for a very long time, and another one who is going to go in a couple of years. So when I say that the conflict's not going to end, it's not that I don't care. It's not that I don't know what it is to be awake at night wondering what your kid is doing. But it's to say that I know what I know. And I know deep down what you know too, which is that the conflict actually depends on just the ending of the conflict, depends on just one thing changing. Depends on the end of Arab recalcitrance when it comes to recognizing the state of Israel. That's all it would take. Recognize the state of Israel, insist, let's say even hypothetically, on the 67 borders, give or take, with a few little adjustments here and there, leave Jerusalem out of the equation, and give up armed resistance. How many days would it take for Israelis to overwhelmingly, in a plebiscite, accept that deal? In a week, it'd be done. So it's not up to us to solve it. It's not up to the Americans to resolve it. It's up to them, and it's going to happen eventually, I hope, but it's not going to happen soon. And therefore, the argument of the book is that since the war never is a long time, but since the war may never end, or the war is not going to end at any point in the near future, we have an unbelievably important new agenda, which would have seemed unnecessary a generation or two ago, but which is critical today. And that is to entirely change the discourse about the state of Israel. Because as long as the Rorschach test for young American Jews 35 and younger about Israel yields conflict and Palestinians and roadblocks and checkpoints and occupation and so on and so forth, they are going to walk away. And the numbers are clear all over the map. They are walking away. And the question that they cannot answer is perhaps the most important question. And that's, why do we need the state in the first place? Why do the Jews need a state? When the UN votes today, why is the vote wrong? Why is it fundamentally, morally wrong? And the answers that we commonly give are inadequate and are actually turnoffs to the younger generation. An argument that we often give is actually the argument that President Obama used in Cairo, from which he correctly later backed away. But that argument was, well, because it happened in the Second World War, the Jews need a state. And you know as well as I do that study after study after study shows that young American Jews in that younger generation do not want to hear about the Second World War. They are Holocaust exhausted. There is really a term out there in the literature called Holocaust fatigue. They don't want to hear about it. It is not too much of a massaging of the numbers to say it's almost correct, to say that the Holocaust is about half as long ago as the Civil War, more or less. Which is an extraordinary thing, because the Civil War might as well have been in the Ice Age as far as young American kids are concerned. And we're halfway there in the Holocaust already. For those of you who are in your 60s or 70s, whatever, it feels like yesterday because you were alive or born immediately thereafter. For somebody like me in their 50s, I wasn't born immediately thereafter, but it was very, very raw still as I was growing up. When I was growing up, Elie Wiesel's book, Night, was still a phenomenon. And after Night came the Six-Day War and the sense of Jewish vulnerability all over again. I remember very vividly, as I guess an 8-year-old kid, in 1967, one of 3 boys, 2 parents, one of those old nuclear families, the way they used to be on television, where the parents actually love each other and live together and have children together and just sort of do it that old-fashioned way. And we all had not like assigned seats at the dinner table, but we always all sat in the same place at the dinner table. And it was a family where, I'll be honest with you, my mother made the food and served it. My father made a sort of feeble attempt at doing the dishes afterwards. And then she finally said to me, no, let me do that because everything here is going to break, or something like that. But I remember very vividly that my father, even though we very often worked at night, was almost always home for dinner. And we always sat together, and we always ate, and we talked, and we did whatever we did. And I remember that when I was about 8 years old, in the middle of June 1967, my parents didn't eat. My mother made food, and the 3 of us, I was the oldest of the 3 boys, sat at the same table in the same places, and my parents paced across the kitchen, watching this tiny little black and white television set with this guy named Walter Cronkite. And I didn't understand then what was going on, but I remember saying to my parents, why aren't you eating? And my father looked at us and said, we're not hungry. Because you don't eat when your people is about to revisit the unbelievable vulnerability that it had barely escaped a couple of decades earlier. But that worked out okay, those 6 days in June, and the more than 6 days in October 1973 started out very bad, but they also worked out mostly okay, though not nearly as well as 67 did. And it's gotten to the point that young American Jews, and young Jews in Israel, by the way, no less, take Jewish survival and Jewish security entirely for granted. So when you talk to them about the Shoah, when you mention the Holocaust as a justification for why we need a state, it's like saying the reason the United States needs to be here is because if there's a last boatload of pilgrims from England that hasn't yet made it, somebody should be here to welcome them with open arms. It's absurd. There's nobody else coming from England. If they are, they're not pilgrims. The other argument that's commonly given is, well, we need, because things could go bad in other places. It's already not so great in France, and it could get a lot worse in France. It got a lot worse in Buenos Aires a number of years ago, and that could happen once again. Now that's a little bit closer to home for some people, but I'll tell you why it fails on 2 counts. First of all, because young American Jews don't feel terribly responsible for French Jews or Argentinian Jews. They just don't. It's a whole separate conversation, but the notion of Jewish peoplehood, as opposed to Jewish religion, is much less pronounced in the self-identification of young American Jews than it was a generation or 2 ago. So they don't feel this tremendous bond with Jews everywhere else in the world, Soviet Jews, French Jews, Argentinian Jews, Mexican Jews. It's different. And even more importantly, because it's 3:30 in the morning in Israel, which means that my son is actually out there somewhere. I don't know where he is, I just know it's not in a bed. And if you were to find him somewhere and ask him why he and his friends, colleagues, whatever you call them, are doing what they're doing, it would not be for French Jews. You can't do what they're doing day after day, night after night, week after week, month after month, year after year. You can't do what their mothers do, which is to call their kids at 11 o'clock at night before they go to bed and never get an answer, and to try to convince themselves that their kid is okay and to get in bed and stare at the ceiling for hours on end until they finally fall asleep. To hear from them a day or 2 later, I don't know how I missed your call, and everybody's lying to everybody about everything. You can't do that because one day the French Jews might need a place to run to, with all due respect to the French Jews. You can only do that because you believe that the very essence of this country is about you, and about your life, and about what you believe in, and what you consider sacred. We have to change the discourse about the state of Israel away from the Shoah happened a long time ago and never again, so we need Israeli soldiers to run up Masada, which is ridiculous. Or we've got to change it from the French Jews and the Argentinian Jews, and God only knows which other Jews may need a place to run to, because that's way in the future, and American Jews and Israeli Jews, neither of them actually feel terribly vulnerable, so it's not going to be for that. We have to begin to ask ourselves the question, why do the Jews need a state? Why do the Jews deserve a state? And why is it of paramount importance that the Jews do whatever they need to do in order to make sure that the state not only survives, but flourishes? There's been an unbelievable, extraordinary change in the entire sense of what it means to be a Jew. Jews today have a certain self-confidence and a certain hope that in 1946 would have been unimaginable. 65 years ago, you could not have imagined the Jews of the Upper West Side being as they are today. And 65 years ago, you could not have imagined the Jews of Stamford, Connecticut being what they are today. What changed that was the State of Israel. Because with the State of Israel, and the very first thing that it did the point that I want to make is that the State of Israel re-injected the idea of hope back into the Jewish people. Now, does it mean that no Jews had hope? Of course I don't mean that. Were there Jews who emerged from the Shoah still deeply hopeful about a Jewish future? Of course there were. Were the youth groups in England and in France and in Palestine deeply hopeful about a Jewish future? Yes. It's not that there was no hope, but it was a people that was feeble. It was a people that was tiptoeing. It was a people that was shell-shocked. And what Israel fundamentally did is it provided the Jewish people a project that would focus all of its energies and all of its passions and all of its dreams and allow it to move from licking its wounds to building its future. Zionism said exactly that. We believe that we are going to be the masters of what history is going to become. History is not going to be the master of us. And that is the first major thing that Zionism restored to the Jewish people, a sense of hope and a sense that we can actually try to guide or shift history a little bit. And what you have to try to imagine is what happens to the Jews if we lose that. You take that away from the Jews. 2009, 2010, Stamford, Connecticut, where it really doesn't get much better. And the life that you have here is over in a generation. It's not that people are going to come marauding through and burn crosses on your front lawns, or that it'll be illegal to come to this building or a synagogue or a federation. It won't be that. It'll be the sense of pride and holding one's head high that we just take for granted as part of the Jewish experience, which is a direct result of the fact that we now have a state, would be lost. And it would be the second time in the space of a century when we suffered a grievous loss from which it's not clear that we could recover. You can do it once. Twice? Without the project of rebuilding that Zionism afforded us after the first one? Not at all clear. So part of what's at stake here is not just borders, and not just an army, and not the Israeli Philharmonic Orchestra, not the Israel Museum, all of which are important, but the very core of hope, security, and flourishing that are at the very core of the Jewish people. I want to push it a little bit further. And I want to ask you to think about the following two groups: the French, the Spanish, and the Italians, and the Chechens, and the Basques, and the Tibetans. They all have languages. They all have histories. They all have literatures. They all have religions. They all have cultures. But if I had given you those six mixed up and asked you to separate them into two groups, you would have separated them exactly that way. You would have put the French and the Italians and the Spanish, whoever else I gave you, on one side, and the Basques, the Chechens, and the Tibetans on the other side. And you would know, by the way, that the first group are actors in history, and the second group are pawns in history today. The first group hold their heads high in the international community. The second group look longingly onto the picture as if they wish that they could join. And the difference isn't that one is smart and one is not smart, or one is noble and one is not noble, or one has a culture and one doesn't have a culture, or one has a language that doesn't have a language. The other one, it's got nothing to do with anything except for the fact that one group has a state and the other group don't have states. The Chechens, the Basques, and the Tibetans all want states. The Basques act it out in Spain periodically. The Tibetans try very hard to survive, and so on and so forth. The Chechens have their problems with the Russians. They all want states. They just don't have them. If I were to ask you which group, before I explained all of this, which group do you put the Jews in, without thinking you would have said, of course, we're in the first category. Of course we're in the first category. We are. We have a state and a language and a history and a culture and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You imagine what it would do to our sense of self to go into the second category. So if Zionism did the first thing, which was to restore to us a sense of hope and a belief in the possibility of a future, and to restore in us the belief that we could once again flourish, another thing that it has done is it has restored us to the group of actors in world history. We participate in this now. We do not actually live at the whim of the rest of the world. We are part of that rest of the world. And like every nation, we will do some things well, and we will do some things not well. We'll do some things right and some things wrong. A lot of things we'll do with pride, and some things we'll be ashamed of what we did, like every single country. But it's only the Zionists, by the way, when they do something that the world might think is a little bit wrong, that the world decides effectively that the country shouldn't exist. There's no other country anywhere on the planet about which there is actually, in the New York Review of Books, conversation as to whether the country ought to exist. North Korea is not a great place to live. It develops nuclear weapons after being told that it may not do so, and nobody has a conversation about whether it should be allowed to exist. China does what it does to all sorts of people, including the Tibetans, but its own citizens. Nobody discusses whether China has a right to exist. Afghanistan, why are we in Iraq? We're in Iraq to return Iraq to its rightful owners, the Iraqi people. There's no sense that Iraq shouldn't exist. We're just trying to give it back to the Iraqi people. We're having trouble finding the Iraqi people. That's a problem, because there actually is no Iraqi people. For that you can thank the British. But that's the business that we're in. There's only one country anywhere about which is a conversation. Does this country have a right to exist? That's us. Which is extremely problematic, because what it's about really is not only whether the state of Israel should have a right to exist, it's really about the future of the Jews. You imagine what it would be like for your children and your grandchildren and eventually your great-grandchildren, how high they hold their heads now, and if they were in that second category of Tibetans and Basques and Chechens, it's a whole different ballgame. So Israel has restored us to a possibility of a belief in the future, the notion of hope. And the second thing that it's done is it has made us actors in history. Those are two really very extraordinary things, but it goes much further than that. What makes a people a people? What makes a nation a nation? And you have to understand here, by the way, the United States is a tiny bit of an exception because it's a lately created nation, more or less. But if you think about European nations especially, what makes a nation a nation? What makes the French a real nation? What makes the Italians a real nation? What makes the Spanish a real nation? What makes the Russians a real nation? Well, among other things, for example, they have a language. You cannot imagine the French people without French. I mean, you just can't do Maupassant in English. No, you can't. You can translate it, but it's not the same thing. Bialik had the great line when he talked about Jewish text, and he said, reading Jewish text in language other than Hebrew is like kissing the bride through the veil. Which is to say, does it count as a kiss? Yes, it is technically a kiss. Is it the stuff of which dreams are made? No. Unless you're a dressmaker, I guess, in which case, you dream about veils. But other than that, it's not the stuff of which dreams are made. You can't imagine a Verdi opera being as powerful in a language that's different than Italian. And I don't speak a word of Russian. I actually speak 5 words of Russian, but I don't speak Russian. But anybody who knows anything knows that reading Dostoevsky in English is not the same thing as reading Dostoevsky in Russian. And if you know Hebrew and you read Amos Oz in Hebrew, and then you read it in an excellent English translation, you still know there's 100 light years between the power of the Hebrew and the power of the English. Part of what makes all of those nations real nations is that, among other things, they have a language. We also have a language, which we have only because of our state. Leaving aside liturgical works and Sidurim and Chumashim and that sort of thing, there's not a single Hebrew book published outside of Israel for all intents and purposes. Not a novel, not a work of nonfiction, nothing. With the exception of some really whatever, there's no serious Hebrew music being produced outside of Israel. There's no serious Hebrew film being produced outside of Israel. Now, I don't have to say to a group like this, which is in the midst of really one of the country's great Jewish film festivals, that film is an extraordinarily powerful cultural and artistic modes of expression. You combine that with a people's ancient language, film it on their ancestral home, and you can do pretty powerful things with film. Take away Hebrew from the mix, it's not that interesting. And why do we have Hebrew? We have Hebrew only because we have a country. Without a country, Hebrew goes to be back what it was, a dormant language that a few people in various little academies study and don't really speak, but can understand when they read it, and that's the end. So if Israel has, first of all, restored to us the possibility of hope, and second of all, restored us as actors in the international arena, the third thing that Israel has done is that it has actually restored Jews to being a really authentic people. There's a whole academic literature about what makes a people a people, and typically people point to it has a culture, it has a literature, it has a language, it also has a place. When my parents took me as kids, and we were sort of on this rush against time, which we lost, for my parents to schlep us every summer to a different national park, but there were more national parks than there were summers before we escaped. So it actually didn't happen. But I would say we also did it, what your parents do to you, you do to your children. When your parents do to you, it's abuse. When you do it to your children, it's education. So well, that's just how the world works. So when we took our kids to Yosemite, Yosemite's unbelievable. It's gorgeous. But then we also took our kids, because we just happened to move half across the world, to Shiloh, which isn't really that pretty, and isn't gorgeous, and doesn't have waterfalls, and doesn't have Half Dome, and doesn't have very polite, well-dressed rangers. But it actually has a little hole in the ground where people believe, scholars, archaeologists believe, that the Ark of the Covenant sat for several hundred years. And then you say to your kid, hold it, sit down for a second, and you open up a Tanakh. Or you take them a few miles away to another place, and you open up the Tanakh and you say, turn to chapter 6 of the first book of Samuel. Look, in Kiryat Ye'arim, right here, see? This is where it was. This is the book that tells your story, and this is where it was. It's different than Yosemite. It's not as pretty. And the people are not nearly as well behaved. And there's not a line for anything. There's a bunch of people crowding around. But it's home in a different kind of a way. You get a language. You get a home. You get memory. Israel has more memorials than the United States. Not per capita, not per square kilometer or mile, just absolutely. Israel has more memorials than the United States. And you know, for those of you who've been there, that you actually get there and you feel home in a way that you can't describe. And almost every piece of literature in the academic world that you will look at that talks about what makes a nation a real nation will tell you that it is language, it is literature, and it is having a place to call home. So that Israel has also restored to us a sense of being a real people, not a pretend people, not a fake people, not a make-believe people, not a wannabe people, but a real people. It has changed entirely the perception of what it means to be a Jew. That's what needs to be understood. When we are battling for Israel's security, we are battling for the enduring notion, a new notion, of what it means to be a Jew. I remind you, by the way, that after the Second World War, after the Shoah, after the Holocaust, call it what you will, there was one iconographic, basically, or one icon image of what the Jew was in the Second World War. It was that very famous picture in the Warsaw Ghetto of the little boy with his hands in the air. There's other adults, but nobody's rushing to him. He's effectively all alone. The only thing anywhere near his face is the muzzle of that gun. And he's dressed in his finest. But you should know something about that boy. His parents had actually gone to Palestine and came back to Europe. He's dressed with his long socks, his tall socks, and his coat, and he knows what he's supposed to do. He sees that man with the gun, and he knows what his job as a Jew is. His job is to go like this. And that picture stayed as the icon of what it meant to be a Jew in the world until 1967, when we changed pictures. We just flipped the slide, even before PowerPoint. Because there was a picture of the three young guys at the Wailing Wall. By the way, it's not a religious picture. Their heads are uncovered. They're not looking towards the wall. They're looking away from the wall. They're staring out. And it's not a celebration of militarism. You don't see their guns. Their helmets are off. You can see that they're wearing army uniforms. That's clear. And you know the history well enough to know that they just captured the wall a few hours earlier. But it's not a militaristic picture, and it's not a religious picture. But they're not alone. It's not one, it's three. And there's no enemies. And nobody's threatening them. They are in the prime of their youth and the prime of their vigor. They represent really a new vision of what it meant to be a Jew. That was what we switched. And that came with hope. That came with becoming actors in the international community. And it came with being restored as being a real people. Those two pictures is what it's all about. So when we ask each other, what are we going to do on a day like today when the vote is 114 to 30-something to 18 against? What are we going to do? It's not about an annoyance in New York. It's not about that we're annoyed that they didn't understand the Goldstone thing is wrong. It's about what's all of this is at stake. Are we going to give this up? Are we willing to lose that? And the conversation that we have to begin to engender with ourselves and with our neighbors and with our elected officials, and more importantly, even with our children and our grandchildren, is you don't get how different it used to be. It's been so unbelievably successful that you don't understand what we once were. And then there's another issue, which is that real peoples, real countries, real cultures actually have to make decisions based on their values. Judaism's had values and principles and conversations about them for 2,000 years. But for 2,000 years, we did our foreign policy around the tables of a yeshiva, where the stakes were zero. So the point that I'm trying to make, and it's obviously in much greater detail in the book, and lots of issues that we don't have time to raise tonight, but is that the fundamental issue of the state of Israel is not that we need a state because there was a Holocaust, and not that we need a state because the Jews of France need a place to run to, because America would take them, by the way. There's not that many left. But it's because it changes the entire enterprise of what the Jewish people is all about. It's a game changer. We are a different people because of that state. We are a people with self-confidence and belief in the future. We are a people whose anthem is hope. We are people who look at history and say that history is something that we can actually help direct. And I want to come back to that in a minute. And we are people that has a language and a love of our land and a sense of belonging that we don't have at Yosemite. And that we wouldn't have if it was only books being written here. Because the books being written here are incredibly wonderful, but they're not in our language. And we have a place where the ideas we've been talking about for 2,000 years actually now come home to roost. What do you do when the guy comes from the Sudan and comes knocking on your door? It's a Jewish question. What do you do when they capture your neighbor's kid and you know he's alive and the costs of getting him out are literally horrific? It's a Jewish question. And I want to just go back for one moment to this notion that part of what Zionism has brought to the Jewish people is this idea that we can help shape our destiny, that we are not going to be the tail on the end of the dog ever again. Because that's what we were in the older version of things before the war. We lived when they decided we could live. And when they decided we could die, it was time for us to die, we died. Very obediently. We could live in a certain country as long as they decided they wanted us. And when the British decided 1,000 years ago they didn't want us, we were gone. And when the French decided in the 1940s that they were going to turn over more Jews than the Nazis actually asked for, we were gone. And when in Greece and Saloniki they decided to cooperate, they got rid of every single solitary Jew. Every single one. Very effective. And we went where we were told. And Zionism made a promise to the Jew. The promise that Zionism made was, you are not going to be the person who lives and dies at the whim of somebody else. You can actually take responsibility for your future. You can protect yourself. You can actually shape your own destiny. That was one of the great promises that Zionism made to the Jew. And it's in light of that promise that you can actually shape your own destiny. You can decide when you're going to die, and you can decide where you're going to live, that you have to understand the utter importance of Iran not getting a bomb. Because what you need to understand is this. Iran does not need to use the bomb. It just needs to have it. Because the minute it has it, every Israeli mother tucks her kid in at the end of the day and puts the little stuffed animal exactly where it's supposed to go. And the door has to be 34.625 degrees open. And this nightlight has to be on, and that bathroom light has to be on. You have to come back every 36.4 seconds and say, we're still here. All the stuff that you do here, we do there, just from right to left. And it's a hoax. It's a charade. Because you can put the stuffed animal exactly where it goes, and you can put the nightlight on, and you can do everything, but you actually can't keep your kid alive. Your kid's going to die when somebody else decides your kid's going to die. And every parent knows that. The kid doesn't know it, not yet. He or she will grow up and figure it out. But it means that every time you put your kid to bed, and you sit on the side of their bed and you rub their back and you read them a bedtime story, and if you sing the Shema, you sing the Shema, whatever you do, and the whole little ritual of putting your child to bed is acted out to create a sense of security, it's actually a lie. Because the parent knows, we're going to go to sleep. And this guy called Ahmadinejad, he could wake up and decide to press the button. And whether my kid wakes up in the morning is not dependent on me anymore. And it's not dependent on my oldest child who's probably out there in green protecting. It's up to some guy out there. When he decides that we're vapor, we're vapor. They just have to have the bomb. They just have to own it for them to turn Zionism into a lie. Which is why I believe Bibi Netanyahu. I don't necessarily like Bibi Netanyahu or all the things that he stands for, but I believe him on this. I believe he's not going to let it happen. And the rest of the world is actually busy buying into the exact opposite of what Zionism said. Zionism said history is something that we can actually direct. The rest of the world is saying, what can we do? So the day is going to come, I think, or the day very well may come, when the West will have failed. And somebody somewhere in a building not far from where I live is going to make a decision that we did not come this far to once again be in the position that we will live as long as they decide and will die when they're ready. And when Israel does what it may one day do, And the world responds much worse than it responded in Operation Cast Lead in Gaza a few months ago. We have to be ready as a Jewish people. Not with stridency and obnoxiousness to say they're just Arabs and who cares. Not like that. Say, we kept begging. We kept asking. For 8 years, they shelled Gaza. For 8 years. We begged you to stop it. You could have stopped it. You could have cut off all aid. Could have blockaded them. Could have done a lot of things. Said something. You didn't do anything. And then we chose to defend ourselves, and it took 12 hours. And the world's opprobrium started to roll in, and today's the ultimate comeuppance. And now it's the same thing. We're just not willing to go back to 1938. Because we understand that the essence of being a Jew is entirely different. The existential condition of Jewishness in 2009 is entirely other from what it was in 1938, and we're not going back there. So we're going to do what we have to do so that our children grow up believing what we believe, which is that history is something that you can actually help shape. And that to be a Jew can mean that you actually live because you decide you're going to live. And you can be home, and you can have your language, and you can have an ancestral place that was once yours that's yours once again, and you can walk around your homeland with a Tanakh in one hand and the steering wheel in the other, and you can say that's where that happened, and turn a few pages, and that's where that happened, and know that you belong here in a way that you don't belong anywhere else. What Israel has done for the Jews and to the Jews is really on nobody's radar screen. Nobody talks about it. Even Barack Obama, a very, very, very smart guy, gets it completely wrong. We don't have a country because bad things happened during the Second World War. We have a country because for 2,000 years we've been robbed of one, and justice was finally done. Now, before I conclude, which I'll do in a minute or two, a rabbinic minute or two, like by 11, I want to make it very clear that nothing about this means that this has not come at horrendous and horrific cost to the other people who live there. And I don't think most Israelis think that there's been no cost. I know for a fact that most Israelis are very disturbed by the cost. And the rest of the book, which we're not going to get into tonight, talks about what do you do? How do you make space for Israeli Arabs who are asked to sing Hatikvah? Why should that be their anthem? And they're asked to have a flag that's designed to look like a tallis. I understand why they don't want that. And the book talks about, what do you do about that? And if you believe that the Jews need a state for the same reason that we've been talking about for the last 6.5 hours, well, then the Palestinians probably deserve a state for the same reason. I think they do. I personally believe that they do. There's nobody in the Middle East who's tried to do more to make a Palestinian state than the Israelis. If the Palestinians have done as much to create a Palestinian state as the Israelis have done, there'd be a Palestinian state. So we don't have time to go into it tonight, but the last part of the book, the last several chapters, look at all the hard questions. What do you do about these Israeli Arabs? What do you do about these Palestinians who claim to want a state? What do you do about the separation of church and state? What do you do about the sense that a lot of Israelis don't want to know a lot about Judaism, but then when they grow up, they can't really talk about why a Jewish state matters? Can you mandate Jewish education? Can you separate church and state the way you can here, or is that a dangerous problem? And it goes on and on and on. But I don't want to give anyone the impression that because of my profound belief about the transformative impact of the state of Israel and the Jews, that it comes at zero cost. It comes at tremendous cost. It's also creating a chasm between Israeli Jews and American Jews, which you have to learn how to bridge. It's not simple. Revolutions are not simple things. But Zionism is fundamentally a revolutionary movement, and that's what the world actually sort of understands. And it doesn't want the revolution to succeed. My grandmother, of blessed memory, who was born in the early years of the 1900s and grew up in Odessa, which was not Stanford. She didn't trust the world. She knew they were out to get her. And I used to say to her, Savta, don't you understand though? It's like the 1970s. Everything's different now. And she would pat me on the head and she would say, you're so cute, which meant, You're so stupid. Right, but no Jewish grandmother can call their children, God say, you're so genius, which I wasn't, so she couldn't say that, but she said I was cute. But she meant I was stupid. And I thought she was old and inflexible. And she was right. And I was wrong. There is still a big part of the world out there that liked us better in 1938 than it liked us in 2008. That sounds xenophobic, and it sounds like my savta. It's actually true, though. And that's what's at stake. It's not the borders, it's not the territories, it's not the checkpoints, it's not a vote here or a vote there. What's at stake in that little country is not the country, it's the people. Not the people who live there, but the people called the Jewish people. What's at stake in the state of Israel is the future of the Jews. And that's why, at the end of the day, there is no agenda Jewishly more important than saving Israel. That, wherever we live, has got to be one of the primary goals to which we commit our lives. You can live here, you can live there. You can do it professionally, you can do it not professionally. But we have to be able to look back on our lives when the time comes and be able to tell our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren that in those years after the world loved us and it fell out of love with us, and we were actually vulnerable once again in ways that we weren't really prepared to reimagine, that we understood, that we knew, that we stood up, and we did whatever it took to make sure that the greatest days of the Jewish people were not in the past, but in a glorious future that still lies ahead. Thanks very much. Thank you very much.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who can send a tax-deductible contribution of $36 or more to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media to help support our programming. Please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD, and we thank you for your kind support.